Well, thank you again and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your brief break. Let's jump right into the next session. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the introduction here. You've got them on the on your app, so you'll clearly know our speakers, our panel members here, our discussion members here. But I'll tell you, we're really excited to have two brilliant cyber experts join us today to give us an update on the various perspectives at the strategic level on the state of cybersecurity and some of the challenges that they're facing in their work. Frank Cilluffo was chosen to lead the Homeland Security Advisory Council shortly after the September 11th attacks. More recently, he served as a member on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and he directs the Auburn University's McCrae Institute, which develops solutions to real-world cybersecurity problems and educates security experts of the future. Chris Inglis, he's been a long-time supporter of AFCEA. He's been a long time, for both these gentlemen, if I read a list of their credentials, it would probably be one of the most impressive list of credentials for anybody that you would hear. But Chris retired in 2014 from the Department of Defense after 41 years of federal service and was recently confirmed as the first National Security Director. Can I have a smile for that applause? He was also a member of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, please provide a warm welcome to Frank Cilluffo and Chris Inglis.
Hey, Frank.
Well, thank you, General, and thank you to AFCEA for the opportunity to join you all this afternoon. I got to get a War Eagle in there, so War Eagle, there we go. But in all sincerity, I'll get a hoorah in there as well. So thank you for your service and for all you and your organization does. I have the privilege to be able to have a conversation with the real person we want to hear from, Chris Inglis, who, quite honestly, he was not only confirmed, but unanimously and by Washington speed at light speed, and for good reason, because the threat environment is pretty active, and we certainly need our National Cyber Director in the seat. I'm going to start with a general question, then we're going to get a little bit into the mission of the National Cyber Director, and then we'll maybe jump into a couple of real-time sorts of issues that we're grappling with right now. But Chris, maybe to start us, to step back a little bit and paint a picture. Why now? Why is your office and the mission of your office so important? And what is the backdrop that, quite honestly, I think the light is blinking red, but I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it's been now for a while, but why not now if it's been kind of true that we should do something for quite a while? And I'll draw some parallels. 20 years ago, and just a few short weeks ago, we commemorated this. We experienced something called 9/11. I think most of us can recall with some clarity that the first surprise, stunning surprise, was Garrison was not one and the same as sanctuary. In coming to grips with how we use these instruments of power that were defined as if that was true, right? We had national security institutions that focused overseas, literally overseas, domestic security that focused domestically. And they were essentially unable to detect or to deter, prevent that event. And I don't think that we've solved the problem of Garrison being not a sanctuary, but that lives with us to this day. The second thing I can recall quite clearly about that moment was that we decided as a consequence of that, we needed to connect the dots. The notion is that each of those two communities, which are not even coherent inside of each of those communities, but each of those two communities had well-formed dots that they'd simply failed to share. They'd failed to push those across the permeable membrane. But upon closer examination, what we discovered in the years after that was that neither one of those for that particular event had well-formed dots. Both of them were in a position that unless they collaborated in a fundamentally different way, they would be unable to discover dots that they could only discover together. That they had shards, shreds, hunches, soda straws that they were looking at, and blinded by perhaps the kind of divide that lived between them and the other side, They couldn't see all of it, and therefore the only way to get those dots was to collaborate in ways that were profoundly different than pre-9/11. But even in those days, we were comforted by the fact that the tools of power necessary to deal with that were in the hands of the government. That the government was the supported entity in the private sector, as it always has, innovated, generated capacity, provided the necessary material and big ideas to fuel the government's application of instruments of power to find and to bring to heal this threat of terrorism. 20 years later, Garrison's not sanctuary, hasn't been for quite some time. We still have this problem of how do we form the dots, let alone connect the dots. And the private sector is no longer the supporting entity, it's the supported entity. The government now has reverse roles. It must support the private sector, which is on the front lines, building, owning, operating, driving the defense of critical infrastructure, as well as the vast majority of everything else. So that's the situation, that's the lay of the land. What's happened more recently? From 2017 forward, we've seen an increasingly brazen, audacious, impactful series of attacks propagated not by persons who live in other nations, by nation states. Russia, North Korea, China come immediately to mind. Iran comes in from time to time when they're not busy harassing perhaps the Israelis, but there it is. And what we have found is you don't need to be the target to be the victim, that this can have a sufficiently strong impact on your personal, business, or national security dimension that it becomes borderline existential. And that the adversaries, the transgressors in this space are unbowed, undeterred. They cross anyone's definition of a red line as if they existed. You kind of now add that up with this third wave of cyber attacks. First wave held data and systems at risk 40 years ago. Second wave held critical functions that depend upon that at risk 20 years ago. Third wave now holds confidence at risk. We no longer have the same confidence we once did about whether these critical systems will be there for us when we need them. Will they actually meet the needs as we kind of reach for them, especially in a time of conflict or crisis? Now I think that what you've seen is that there isn't a soul who thinks that cyberspace is unimportant. There isn't a party who actually manages, operates, builds this stuff that doesn't think somebody should do something about this. But therein lies the rub. Right? Cyberspace is still comprised of technology and people and doctrine. That fuzzy last part is roles and responsibilities. Who does what, for what purpose? It's still those three things. It's always been practiced in the presence of an adversary, whether that's nature, a squirrel, or an actual person. But what we now have is everybody agrees something should be done. The Solarium Commission you and I were on actually put a very fine point on that, say that we're approaching an existential moment. Might not be that the use of force hangs in the balance, which makes it all the more insidious, that this is something adversaries think they can get away with without tripping the use of force. And so they're actually going to figure out how to do this in peacetime, being the decisive phase. So that whole story being said, the Solarium Commission recommended that the principal thing that we needed to change was the doctrine. We need to get the roles and responsibilities right. And to begin with, we need to figure out what are the parts, some of which are very capable, very strong, and arraign them in a way that they actually complement one another. That we can no longer afford to essentially have a sequential application of these instruments of power or an isolated stovepiped application of these instruments of power. We need to apply those in an integrated, collaborative fashion where they're concurrently on the field all the time. And I would just summarize that in the premise, why you won't find this in the Solarium report, but this is really the bottom line. We propose you got to beat all of us to beat one of us. That's different, that's new, that's something that respects the properties that are taking place inside this garrison, which is not a sanctuary, draws experience from our counterterrorism kind of world, but also acknowledges that the government needs to go first in supporting the private sector in ways that heretofore it has not. My long story made short, why now? It's late. It's been now for quite some time. What do we need to do? Of course, technology is important, capacity is important, kind of clever, smart, sharp people, critical thinking is important. But the most important thing at the moment is get the roles and responsibilities right, so that we can make best use of the parts we have while we then try to figure out how do we actually augment, accentuate, build up the parts that we don't have. So I would say that, I'm quite pleased that we've taken that turn. It could be transformative, but it will only be if we actually make a meaningful difference against real problems. And so I'm happy to talk to you about what perhaps some of that early work is here.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to start with, and I'm glad you brought up doctrine. So we've had a lot of strategy at the 50,000 foot level. We have a lot of TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures at the ground level, but something tying strategy with the tactical outcomes is lacking. And you brought up 9/11, and this is my own opinion, and I had the privilege to work for President Bush throughout, immediately following 9/11. And I've had some time to think about it, and if you were to tell me what the biggest breakthrough was in our, we had a massive overhaul of the government, but it was the marrying up of Titles 10 and Title 50 that changed our ability to engage in an honest-to-goodness campaign and war against terrorism. When it comes to cyber, it's a little different because how many companies went into business thinking they had to defend themselves against Russia and China? That's precisely what they're dealing with today. So there's a bit of an unlevel playing field. So I'd be curious, I do want to get into the public-private partnership, and for transparency, we had the privilege to have this discussion just last week, but from a doctrinal perspective, you've got this new office of the National Cyber Director. Can you share a little insight on your strategic intent, how you see yourself fitting in with the broader interagency, and then we can sort of jump into the public-private partnership.
Yeah, so first, I strongly agree with the premise, which is that we have to have strategy. In the absence of strategy, nothing can be strategic. It's all episodic. But you also have to have kind of doctrine that then leads to the implementation, the tactics, and the capabilities you bring to bear. I would say that the strategy is emerging. And this isn't emerging simply from the federal government, but broadly, I think most people in the room would say, sounds like we need to make this space inherently more resilient and robust. That's, I wouldn't say a no-brainer, but that's a fairly straightforward proposition. Make ourselves a harder target. I think most of us would acknowledge that you can only get so far in that regard, that these systems are sufficiently dynamic, the conditions are sufficiently changing, whether it's the onrush of technology, the involvement of people, perhaps the uncertain kind of audacity of adversaries. You can make it defensible but not secure. And that's not a statement of failure, it's just a statement of reality, which leads to the second part of the strategy, which says making it defensible, we then need to actually defend it. That's a human proposition. How do you actually use the tools, the sensors, the capabilities that have been brought to bear to discern that there's something amiss, to engage that at the earliest possible opportunity, use all instruments of power in that engagement, not just cyber on cyber, and to do that in a way that you can defend forward, borrowing the term from the Department of Defense, using all those instruments of power, early discernment, early action, early solution, right? That's the defensive piece. But there's a third piece, which is we need to align actions to consequences. Now, oftentimes that's we need to go find and bring to justice, right, the transgressors. That, of course, needs to be a piece of that, and that needs to be done with sufficient regularity and certainty and timeliness that they get the message, that it has a deterrent effect. But we also need to make sure that in aligning actions to consequences, that we ensure that there are rewards for good behavior, that if you've behaved well in this space, that you're going to be assisted by your government, perhaps by those entities that live in the sector with you, but that we will essentially bring our resources to bear such that all of us can help defend each of us. That's not true today, where we typically build, operate, defend these enterprises as independent patches of what would otherwise be a shared infrastructure, where using my insights alone on my patch, using my authorities alone on my patch, I'll do my level-headed best to defend what comes across the boundaries of my patch from somewhere else to God knows where else. Right, that's a recipe for failure that we've been practicing for far too long. So the strategy is that. It's those three pieces, understanding that collaboration is the necessary modality, and understanding that it's all instruments of power. This is an instrument of power, cyber, that must derive benefit from all other instruments of power. So the practical aspects of how you then begin to do that, I'm happy to have a conversation about, but the doctrine extends from there. What you've asked are the roles and responsibilities that the National Cyber Director would take on. Well, first, it has to have some degree of humility and realize that it's not the only player in this space. There are many others. One of the favorite questions in Washington, if you haven't been there lately, it's still there. One of the favorite questions in Washington is we'll throw up an org chart, and it's a quite noble question. It's a quite, kind of intuitively appealing question. Throw up an org chart, which is horribly complicated, all God's creatures on it, and they say, who's in charge? Right? That's a hierarchical question of who actually can tell everybody else on the chart what to do, when to do it, how to do it. In the moment of a crisis, that's a quite reasonable question, because you want to make sure that there's unity of command, unity of messaging at that moment. And given that you're encountering a real world situation, and you can't have a jazz band on the field, you need to have some vertical clarity. But across the long arc of where we are most days, that's not really the right question. The right question is, who's accountable for what, under what circumstances, and for what purposes? Now, that's a terribly complicated question, but it's the reality of the situation, such that if we can say, these are the things that I would expect this entity to do under these conditions, with these collateral, perhaps, boundaries, and to this effect, that's actually the way most things work in the other domains of interest, where the Secretary of Defense is not flying F-16s over some far-flung battlefield. That's delegated, and there's an expectation they know what their connection is to that larger purpose. I'll just kind of close with this and then go to the NCD piece, because I don't want this to be about the NCD, but rather about what we do. Any successful enterprise that engages or involves human beings typically has three properties. And this is any successful enterprise. The first is when you ask everybody in that enterprise, what do we do here? They give you generally the same answer, right? You don't get somebody saying, I'm a mathematician, we do math, and somebody else saying, I'm a mechanical engineer, so we do kind of line drawings. They all say, no, the larger purpose, the thing that holds us together, that I show up to work for, is X. If cyber is a team sport, if cyber has got to be a collaborative activity, it might be that moniker that I put on the street earlier, which is, what we do together is we make it such that an adversary needs to beat all of us to beat one of us. Now, there are individual pursuits inside of that, but that's what we do together. The second part of the success is that everybody knows what they do to make that happen. Everybody knows what their contribution to that is. Whether they're in the private sector, the public sector, individual, organizational, they all know why they show up and what it is they have to contribute. And that degree of connection, that professional connection, can self-organize so that all of those contributions are complementary. It works that way in the physical world, where police and militia and TSA and NORAD are all at this moment not conferring with each other on a moment-by-moment basis, but yet they complement each other in achieving some degree of physical defense. The third piece is the most important piece, which is that everybody in that enterprise acts like an owner, not an employee. Something goes amiss, something comes off the rails, they don't stand there and say, not my job to clean up the mess on aisle 9. They step in and say, I'm going to do something about that, right? Such that we have this ability to discern changes we might not have anticipated, and everyone, the closest point of approach to that is the person who says, I'm going to do something about that, I'm going to make that happen. Unfortunately, in cyberspace today, we have this idea that something should be done by someone. Who is that magic someone? I'm not trying to dodge the bullet on this, though I will. Who is that someone? It's us. It's all of us. And the job is, how do we figure out what those various complementary roles and responsibilities are so that we have a common objective, we know how we're individually attached to that, and we all act like owners. So the four roles of the NCD, kind of taking all of that aboard, are the following. Drive federal coherence. How do we build, operate, and defend the digital infrastructure that the federal government makes use of? Now, that might not be terribly interesting to somebody that's outside the federal government. If that's all we did, I know how we could save a lot of money. We don't need it, right? But the second part of that federal coherence is, how do we make sure that as we work with or support the private sector, remember, we're the supporting entity, how do we make sure that the federal government is coherent in the provision of that support? As the National Security Agency engages the defense industrial base, as the Department of Energy engages the energy sector, as Cisa tries to quarterback and synchronize all of that, how do we make sure the government knows what the government knows, and the government provides services such that you don't need a PhD in government to figure out how to deal with us? We're not particularly good at that at the moment, though the hearts are pure. Everybody's trying to lean in and do the right thing. That's the first broad responsibility. The second point of accountability for the NCD is to drive public-private collaboration. I've already made the case for how that's different than division of effort, which is inherently an agreement to not collaborate, however noble that might be. But in this space, it's got to be collaboration. We can only find things together that no one of us can find alone. Third, broad accountability for the NCD is to drive present and future resilience across technology, people, and doctrine. Are our people up to it, not simply today, which is largely a react and respond proposition, but are they up to it in the future where they're going to be the first point of approach of a transgressor in this space, and they need to know what their role is, whether they have cyber or IT in their name or not. Everyone needs to know something about what their role, what their responsibility is, and make it such that they're an active component of preventing these disasters as opposed to knowing how to call 911 to bring somebody to the party. And doctrine. I've talked a lot about doctrine. I won't beat that again. The fourth piece that the National Cyber Director kind of has, slightly again, somewhat introverted, somewhat introspective, is to do performance assessment. Formally accountable to report to the Congress about where the cyber dollars are, to what purpose, to what end game they've been expended. But we'll take a slightly broader kind of interpretation of that to talk about all cyber resources, whether it's people or doctrine, authorities, or dollars, and try to give an account of whether we've got the right strategy, whether it's achieving the right ends, and ultimately whether it should be reinforced. And oftentimes that reinforcement may come as much or more from authority as it will from the next dollar. My premise is we need to make sure we've made best use of the dollars, the people already on the street, before we go ask for another one. Hopefully that's helpful, Frank.
No, that was very comprehensive. And I guess the right question is not who's in charge, but who's in charge of what, and making sure that you have the ability to assemble and unify some of these pieces. And you mentioned authorities, you mentioned accountability. I would always argue there's a third critical criteria: authority, accountability, and resources. Policy without resources is rhetoric. It's a good idea. How do we ensure we have the resources to meet this massive set of issues? And will you sort of have the ability to look across the federal government to make sure that even though, take water systems, may not have the same level of security as, say, the energy sector does or the electricity sector does, but is critical to our economy, to our public safety, and to our national security? So is that something you envision the National Cyber Director?
I do, not alone. And I'll talk a little bit about a connection with the Office of Management and Budget that we've announced this afternoon. But first, I'll take the very narrowly framed part of that question, which is literal resource, the dollars, right, that often constitute, the flow of backstopping authority, the flow of material or people, billets, right, to the problems that matter. The Congress has shown itself quite willing and quite nonpartisan in this regard to fund what is required, what's necessary. We're at the moment trying to figure out how to spend $1 billion. That used to be a lot of money, but it's only a down payment on something called the Technology Modernization Fund. How do you kind of respond and correct a tech debt, right, that has been built up over the last 10, 15 years of multi-factor authentication, segmentation, zero trust architectures that are notional at the moment, but not kind of implemented broadly across the government. So we're trying to figure out how to do that, and we've had nothing but full-on support from the Hill to get that done. And I expect that while money will be challenging, I don't think that's going to be the biggest problem. The larger resource issue is, have we made best use of the resources that are already on the street? Back to an earlier point that I made. Do we, in fact, have an alignment, a harmonization of the various capabilities, authorities, talents? Does everybody in the room think that it's partly their responsibility to get this done? Are there a lot of bystanders or employees as opposed to owners in this space? And so oftentimes when someone would ask me, who's going to solve this problem? There's an expectation that it's a rhetorical question. That would be you, of course, and that you have to kind of figure out how to stand in and fix this problem without incurring upon privacy and proprietary interest. That's not possible here. So what we have to do is to figure out how to mobilize all of these resources such that everyone's making a positive difference, some small, some big, but all done in a complementary fashion. That's the deal in the physical world, right? I locked my car in front of this convention center when I came in. I brought my iPad in, not because I'm going to read it while I'm talking to you, but I know that USAA will not pay the claim if I left it on the dashboard with the keys in the car, because that's the most convenient thing. That's a very trivial example, but what's the equivalent to that in cyberspace? And what's the point of accountability imposed on an individual, an organization, a sector to participate, meaningfully participate as owners of this problem? The federal government needs to go first in that regard, which is to demonstrate that it's willing, able, and has the means to generate a viable contribution to this space. So, which is why I put that first box first, which is federal coherence. Make the federal government a viable partner that proactively applies its instruments of power, right, to the creation of conditions in this space that are more likely than not to realize our positive aspirations, resilience, robustness, and our ability to go about our business without having to worry about threats.
And that's something I think much of this audience has great expertise. The old adage, what gets measured gets done, but are we measuring what matters? And getting to the point where we have real metrics and MOEs that sort of make sense, I think is a great point. You brought up sort of the partnership and the collaboration piece, especially with the private sector. And to a large extent, they're the owners operators, they're the drivers, and the federal government is more in a support sort of function in some ways, sort of the way your former employer, the National Security, it was a subordinate, it supported other combatant commanders and other agencies and the like. What does that look like in the cyber environment? And I've got to ask, just because you're no longer part of Solarium, but you know, we've spent a lot of time and effort on what we call the designation of systemically important critical infrastructure. So if everything's critical, nothing's critical. So we get down to those that are literally lifeline sectors to our economy, to our national security, to our public safety. And we're looking at what that right balance of carrots and sticks or benefits and burdens are. Firstly, do you think that that makes sense? And secondly, with the public-private partnership, we're talking about much more than just information sharing, aren't we? We're talking about operations, shoulder by shoulder in the same foxhole getting stuff done. Is that fair?
Yeah, both of those things make sense. Let me take the first point first, which is you can't defend all things against all perils. Everybody knows that. And so if we were to say that there are 16 critical infrastructures, because broadly that's 16 ways to define what critical means, and if we were then to further imply that everything inside of every one of those 16 critical infrastructures should be defended with equal fealty, we'd find ourselves, pretty quickly exhausted. That simply can't be done. And therefore, either you prioritize inside of those sectors to say this is most important to least important, or you do something I think that's considerably more thoughtful, which you suggested, which is to figure out what the connective tissue is between those sectors that creates the critical functions that we care about. So if you've cared about the economy, I think we all do, you say, well, what makes the economy viable, possible? Of course, financial flows and the ability to store, kind of retrieve, kind of synthesize, combine various financial objectives, that matters. But that depends upon telecommunications, that depends upon energy, that depends upon water flows, that depends upon so many other things, and so it becomes less about the vertical, known as the financial sector, and more about the horizontal. So the systemically critical infrastructure initiative, which is not yet instantiated in law, but it's a pretty solid idea, would say that we need to actually cut across these things. Cisa, over at the Department of Homeland Security a year ago, suggested that it might be, upon a cursory analysis, that there are 55 critical threads that essentially underpin the critical functions within the United States kind of economy. And that if we figured out what those were, just walk each of those threads and then find the subcomponents on those threads and then did a crosswalk across those, we might quickly begin to see what those things are that are the most critical activities upon which everything else depends in a cascading fashion. That makes great sense, and we're actually engaged in that activity to try to figure out how to do the horizontal so that we can then prioritize the verticals. The second point that I would make is that if you do that, you have to figure out what are the various activities you undertake to ultimately get to the defense, and there are probably three categories of activity. The first would be, can you understand what's actually happening in that space? Right, those are kind of the analytic discernment moments where, do I understand how the system is actually operating? Do I understand who's challenging that? Do I understand the life forces in that system? I've argued earlier in this conversation that has to be done in a collaborative fashion. We cannot find the dots alone. We therefore have to work together to form and use those dots. With that big picture, we can then figure out how do we defend on our owned or leased premise, right? Those things that we're authorized to do because this is my property or I kind of have the right to do something on that property, typically the work of CISAs or CISOs, or the work of those who directly support them through contractual or sometimes governmental relationships. But there's a third piece, which is there are things holding me at risk outside of my owned premise, and do we stand idly by and wait for them to essentially choose the time and place of their engagement of us, or do we say we're going to hold them at risk? We're going to degrade that, we're going to disrupt that. If, say, hypothetically, there was a sanctuary somewhere in the near abroad of Russia that was engaged hypothetically in this scourge that we might say call ransomware, do we stand idly by and say we're going to accept that, or do we use instruments of power to hold that at risk, to degrade it, to disrupt it, to bring it to heel? That's an inherently governmental proposition if you're operating off-owned territory, and if you're using instruments of power of the sort I've described. But those three are related, and all of those need the sort of prioritization scheme that you've suggested, Frank, which is, do I even know what I care about in my discernment? Do I know what then I would spend time and attention trying to defend? And do I know what degradation I need to undertake because it holds these two things at risk? Those are all collaborative activities. They're connected activities, but again, back to the question of who's accountable for what, there will be a slightly different org chart for each one of those. And each of those are underway.
I've got to say, the hypothetical is not so hypothetical. So I'm saying it, not you, but quite honestly, two countries do provide for safe haven for a vast majority of the ransomware operators. Go figure, who? No, China and Russia really are a challenge, and working with our allies to get our arms around this is going to be critical as well. Tyranny of time requires I be a bit of a tyrant. I want to pick up two quick questions. One, workforce. Not enough people are in this business, and those that are in huge demand, and it seems like we're all fishing in the same pond. How do we build out the cyber workforce, which I think is a critical national security imperative for our country going forward? And we need the ninjas, we need the equivalent of the SEALs and Delta Force for cyber, but we also need the blocking and tackling. Everyone needs to be somewhat cyber aware and savvy, since the vast majority of the cyber incidents are from phishing. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are on the workforce and how you plan to tackle that. And then, since you brought up hypothetical countries, you and I have spent a lot of time through Solarium. We spent a lot of time trying to get and articulate the cyber deterrence strategy right. And ultimately, if we don't impose cost and consequence on bad behavior, we shouldn't be the ostrich that gets surprised with its head in the sand when it gets kicked in the most obvious place.
So I agree, and I'll try to be succinct, but we should talk about education for a very long time, because that's an essential component. And it's not just education. Yep. To your point, it's about education, it's about training, it's about awareness. But I think first and foremost, you need to acknowledge that it's a vital, not a discretionary component of the system, of the whole. And that we don't have enough people who have enough skills to properly build, operate, and defend, right, this realm. But it's not just about, as you, I think, suggested, the people who have cyber or IT in their names. It's about anyone who helps build and operate this space or is accountable for this space, CEOs or COOs for that matter. They need to know something more than they would get simply by being proximate to this space. And it's also about every user of this space understanding that they have a responsibility, just like I locked my car and I don't leave the iPad on the dash of the car. So we got to solve all of those. Good news is there are any number of terrific initiatives underway. Right? The National Institutes of Standards and Technology has the National Initiative for Cyber Education. DoD, DHS have the Centers for Academic Excellence, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that they're kind of well joined up in terms of, do we have a comprehensive strategic approach that says we've covered all those eventualities? And I don't think we've appealed to a broad enough population so that we can make sure that every person who could possibly be engaged in this has been given an opportunity to understand it, perhaps an opportunity to be inspired by that challenge. And we've not defined the jobs such that we really know what we need. Too many of them are classified as you need a computer scientist. So we've solved all of those things. And I know that FC is going to sponsor a conference sometime in the new year, which is going to take that on. I don't simply applaud that. I will champion that in every way that I can, but it's going to be a significant part of our agenda going forward. Now, you've also asked
upskilling
about,
vets in particular, I think, is an area we can.
You've also asked how do we actually kind of impose consequences to bear on the transgressors.
Stop blaming the victim. Let's flip the equation.
No, I think first I'd begin by saying yes, but I would acknowledge we're not going to shoot our way out of this. Right, we're possibly more dependent on critical infrastructure, digital infrastructure than anyone I can imagine. And if we haven't kind of first made sure that we're in a defensible, well-defended position, then we'd essentially kind of be firing bullets into a glass mirror that would come right back at us with some deleterious effect. That being said, we should hold them accountable and use that both to stop what's going on and to have a deterrent effect on what might go wrong in the future. But the challenge there is you need to do that with some time certainty, and you need to make the impact not simply upon the actors, but those who give those actors sanctuary, those who would enable and perhaps incentivize them to essentially engage in the activities they do. That deterrent activity then has to focus on what are the consequences that matter to them. Most of those consequences might not be found in cyberspace. They might be found outside of cyberspace, which means you have to have a systemic holistic approach to that, which starts with the psychology of the actors and what makes a difference to them, tries to ensure that you understand who's doing what with some time certainty and some granularity that you can then use the instruments of power you bring to bear. That's a strategy that then must be implemented by a series of tactics that are connected to that strategy and therefore remain holistic.
But there's a key point, because cyber is the means to an end. It's not the end state in itself, right?
That's right.
And when you think about it, even whoever's behind the clickety-clack of the keyboard is a person. There is, at some point it's going to be automated, and it is to one extent or another, but there is still where technology changes, human nature remains consistent. And when you actually start imposing cost and consequence, what works in Russia may not work in North Korea.
That's why you have to start with the psychology of the aggressor, right? Not what we think would make a difference to us. Public shaming might mean nothing in some of these countries, right? But what makes a difference to them? You need to start there. You need to bring to bear all the instruments of power, but they need to be properly mobilized and enabled by some degree of timeliness and granularity, and do we know who's who in the zoo? That means you have to have the largest possible coalition that's helping to form that picture, and it needs to be not just private and public, but international in nature.
Awesome. I want to make sure we have time for a question or two, and I think I'm turning it to our good colleagues in the back if there are any questions.
Thank you, sir. Our first question: is the cyber realm covered in the constitutional edict for the government to provide for the common defense?
Well, that's a great question. I wasn't there. But I suspect that if you would explain to them what was going to happen in the year 2021, and that there was this issue of kind of health, life, and safety being held at risk by nation states or transgressors who had the capacity of nation states, they would say that fits under common defense, whether you spell that with a C or an S, that it's in there. And I think the U.S. government, standing out of my role and now going back to private citizen Chris Inglis, the U.S. government has come a long way in that regard. Many in the room may remember 2012, 2013, when the nation state of Iran was going denial of service attacks, might be nuisance attacks, but they were kind of disrupting financial activities day after day after day across 200 different days. And the U.S. government in the day decided not to stand in, not because it was feckless, but because it thought that this was an issue of propriety, that the private sector kind of had the sovereign right to build, operate, and defend digital infrastructure as they saw fit. Now, I'm cartooning that a bit, but that was the conclusion. That sends the wrong messages to everyone, to a citizen that the U.S. government's not going to use its resources for the common defense, to the Iranians that you can do what you will to my citizens so long as you do it in cyberspace. Terrible messages. When the North Koreans then did something to Sony Pictures in 2014, we came over and said, we will use government assets, resources, authorities to defend our private sector when they're held at risk by a nation state at a time and place of our choosing. Now that's sufficiently ambiguous that it doesn't help the kind of US citizen. It might be intended to create ambiguity, uncertainty, angst on the part of the North Koreans, but it's a step in the right direction. 2018, we decide that we're going to use at least the DoD military instrument of power to do persistent engagement, forward defense. I think now we're in a place where we say we need to use all instruments of power in that fashion, early discernment, early action, not violating the sovereignty of neutral nations, but rather doing what we've always done in NATO or our forces in South Korea, saying that we will essentially practice this capacity to have early discernment, early action in defense of our legitimate interest. Defense is important, common defense is important, all instruments of power is important. I don't think that that's a new and novel strategy, but it is consistent, entirely consistent with constitutional principles.
It's a great question. Are there any more questions from the back?
Thank you, yes. How will the Office of the National Cyber Director work with CISA and the FBI in regards to election security?
It's a great question. So Jen Easterly, who's the director of Cisa over the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, she describes herself, and I describe her, as the on-the-field quarterback. I describe myself, she describes me as the coach. So my job is to make sure that we're prepared and that the authorities and that the capabilities and that the muscle memory is ready to do the job, but the on-the-field, right, experts, capabilities, are more likely, almost certainly likely, to be found in CISA, the FBI, and other places. And so I just need to make sure that from the role of a National Cyber Director, working with the National Security Council, that we're prepared for that event, that we essentially have assigned roles properly, we've exercised properly, and that in many cases, the election system is one of those, that we're working closely, collaboratively with the private sector, where most of that real work takes place. And so NCD has an accountable function to prepare and to essentially assess the performance. But when the moment comes, you'll find that the on-the-scene kind of experts, the quarterbacks, are in another place.
And I might add linebackers and others. You need all of the above. And I would just add to that excellent question. The role of the cybersecurity directorate at the National Security Agency also plays a big role in this.
Yeah, so I didn't intend to leave them off the field, so to speak. But you know, it's often people say, well, you know, it looks a bit confused, possibly. It looks like it's contention. If you have NSA engaging the private sector, FBI engaging the private sector, CISA engaging the private sector, Department of, and so on and so forth, maybe a dozen different organizations. I would say that that's laden with features. It's not a burden, so long as we create some degree of coherence and cohesion betwixt and amongst those, such that if you've engaged the NSA and NSA has essentially kind of offered you some insights, you get the full benefit of what the government knows, not just what NSA knows. NSA has a very powerful body of expertise and a very powerful source of that expertise through its legitimate lawful mission. But we need to make sure that any engagement with the government essentially gives you the full benefit of what the government knows, and vice versa.
I hate to do this. We are out of time. I think you will all share. Couldn't ask for a better individual than Chris Inglis in the driver's seat. So thank you for your service, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks for what all of you do.
Please welcome Lieutenant General Bob Shay back to the stage to formally thank them on behalf of AFCEA and our audience.
When I started this and I started the introduction, I said we've got two brilliant cyber experts, and I think the discussion that took place today, this afternoon, bore that out. There's a lot of great takeaways. I'm not going to go through all of them, but he left us with a lot to think about. It was a very cerebral discussion, and I think when you think about it, there's so much more to this cyber effort that needs to go on, and it's terribly important that we bring industry, government, and academia, all these as well as our coalition partners together. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for your discussion here today. Certainly super, and we look forward to working with you, Chris, as we set the tone down there in Augusta coming forward. It'll be the 25th to the 27th of January. So the symposium will resume tomorrow morning at 8 with coffee in the exhibit provided by Forrescow and Karasov. You can see the rest of tomorrow's program and the agenda in your app. Please note that the exhibit hall opens early with a full set of theater and innovation showcase sessions. And right here at 9:30 tomorrow morning, Lieutenant General John Morrison, the Army G6, will give an address on defensive cyber and cyber operations. So we're excited to return to in-person events. So please make sure that you're abiding by the rules that were set up out there. And we're grateful for your compliance with the health and safety protocols that have been established. We look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow morning. And again, thank you to Chris and Frank.
We would like to thank you all for attending today and hope this conference will be a premier professional development event for you. Remember to check www.afcia.org/signal to find Signal's daily coverage of today's events. Enjoy yourself this evening at the reception in the exhibit hall and have a great week here in Baltimore.